How can God be good? I will first make some emotive points. God is absolutely just, and this means that God is also merciful and kind. These words are not just labels, but mean exactly what they say. However, God is not indulgent in the way that a bad parent spoils their children by giving them everything that they crave rather than what is actually good for them. Moreover, God is self-sufficient and has no dependency upon us for any purpose, and certainly not for entertainment or kicks. Hence, God has no motive that could make God either monstrous or vengeful. God's business is that every sapient creature is saved and has eternal peace, fulfilment and joy, coming to share in the divine nature, and so knowing clearly and experiencing fully what beauty and love and justice really are. God cares so much about us that he became one of us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and himself suffered and died. God will go to every possible length to heal and comfort and save every sapient creature. Now for the technicalities. It would seem, given the level of suffering in the world, that one of the following must be true. First, God does not care, and so is in fact unjust. Second, God is unable to do anything about it, and so is actually pathetic. Or three, God is not real, which implies both 1 and 2, of course. Now, in some sense, this is inescapable. But what matters is exactly how God doesn't care and exactly how God is unable to do anything. Now, the ontological argument for God's reality, which I'm not going to go into here, forces one to believe that there can be no conceivable inadequacy in God. Any apparent inadequacy must be to do with the necessary character of an actual situation apart from God's own intrinsic constitution. Hence, God doesn't care about suffering in the world only in the sense that God knows that, for whatever reason, taking more action to relieve or counteract or avert suffering would produce a worse outcome than the suffering itself, and that there is absolutely no way to evade this. I realise that this seems to be an extravagant idea, but as far as I can tell, the ontological argument gives one no option but to believe this. Therefore, it only remains to explore how this might be true. Clearly, it would seem that one way for suffering to be avoided is for God to have not created any universe at all, and sometimes it seems to me that this would have been preferable. However, the ontological argument tends to show that this is impossible. For God to be the greatest conceivable being, God must be capable of conceiving, and in fact also must conceive of, everything which is in fact conceivable. Clearly, this world in which we actually live is conceivable simply because it actually exists. Hence, God must conceive of this universe, most plausibly as one of many possible universes, exactly as it is, of necessity. God has no option. Given this fact, the only way for this universe not to have been created is for there to be a difference between God conceiving of a thing and God creating a thing. And I cannot for the life of me imagine what that difference might be. If there is no difference, as I think makes most sense, then the fact that this universe does exist exactly as it does is as necessary as God is necessary, though only in a derivative way, because of the absolute necessity of God's own being, which is not true of the universe itself apart from God. This argument is fine as far as it goes, but it tends to invalidate the idea that God is just and so merciful. It does this by seeming to make God every bit as much impotent as God is omnipotent. For God's ability to do everything and anything would seem to make God incapable of not doing things which would seem to be cruel. This problem can be solved by focusing on the fact that God is in fact just, and that this is the rock-bottom basis of all the divine perfection. Without justice, understood in the Platonic sense of absolute harmony and peace and the fulfilment of all potential and possibility, unity in diversity, God has no basis for being at all. We have to return to and re-examine and clarify the idea that God must necessarily conceive of and so create every universe which is conceivable. We must ask the question, what makes a thing conceivable? I think there are two parts to the answer. The first is a physics answer, the second a metaphysics answer. Both must be true. One being true and the other false is no good at all. In fact, they're two versions of the same idea, as will become obvious. The physics answer is that for a thing to be conceivable, it must be free from all internal contradictions. In other words, anything which might exist must be a proper solution of all the equations of physics and satisfy all appropriate boundary conditions with no exceptions or glitches anywhere. The metaphysics answer is this. For a thing to be conceivable, it must be free from all external contradictions. In other words, anything which is conceivable by some particular conceiver must be consistent with the character of that conceiver, for else the conceiver would not countenance conceiving it. Hence, a conceiver who is entirely just could not possibly conceive of a situation that was fundamentally unjust. Such a conceiver would immediately conceive of themselves intervening in their conception to make it just. Note how this fits in perfectly with the Judeo-Christian doctrines of divine revelation and of the Messiah, and the Catholic doctrine of the Incarnation and Atonement. It therefore follows that God's constitutional justice acts as a boundary condition to the physics problem and constrains the range of conceivable things to those things which are conceivable by the sole necessary being, which being God is necessarily just. Hence, God's character as being necessary does not force God to create unjust things and situations simply because an unjust conceiver would not be able to conceive of them. In fact, they would not be able to do this in the sense of creating them, as some unjust conceiver would then not be self-sufficient and would itself have no basis for being real, and even if, like Satan, they happen to exist, would not have the divine status which is required to equate conceiving of with creating. Rather, in fact, God's constitutional character as being just necessitates that God only creates just, or at worst justifiable things and situations, and only acts justly. So by remorselessly analysing the implications of the ontological argument, we are forced to conclude that God had to make this universe exactly as it is, because, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, it is fundamentally just. We now have to investigate how this can possibly be the case, granting freely that it seems most implausible. I would interject at this point that we have already solved the problem sufficiently for faith to take over, for it is now clear what the answer is. All that is unclear is how this answer can be understood. What we have done, in fact, is used logic to rule out all the plausible, sensible and obvious options as being impossible, so that we have been left only with one, perhaps highly implausible possibility as being possible. Having done this, it becomes clear that this sole, perhaps highly implausible possibility is necessarily true, even though one can't see as yet how it can be true. This is a great cause for hope, because if the world is fundamentally just, then there is value and purpose within and beneath and above and beyond everything. How can this be the case then, given the suffering in the world, that God is just? There are lots of partial answers, which are all true and mitigate the problem, but without answering the fundamental point. I'm not going to reiterate them here. They're all given in my book, The Good of Being. All I shall do here is sketch out the basic answer. The possibility of suffering is necessitated by the absolute need for humans to learn the difference between right and wrong, between what is good for them and what is bad for them. By no means all particular experiences of suffering achieve this. But even purposeless suffering has to be what it is, or else the entire divine education system would collapse. This is because purposeless suffering, largely what we generally call natural evil, could only be averted by miraculous divine intervention. And once God started intervening in an obvious way to avert purposeless suffering, no criterion could be applied to justify non-intervention in many other cases where some degree of personal fault was involved, but the suffering was disproportionate to the culpability. And then, one way or another, entire indulgence would result, and God's business with and for sentient creation would be subverted and rendered null and void. I've written a whole sequence of poems about this. They're to be found in my book, A Sparrow Falls.